Hi, and welcome to our first video about genetics. Now in this video I want to teach you about how living organisms inherit the traits that they do. For example, here in my basement we have these pea plants. I've been growing these plants for a number of months now, and they've grown so much that they're starting to flower. Now if you look closely at the flowers, like this one right here, it's white. This one is also white, and this third plant also has a white flower. But why do they have white flowers? Why not pink flowers or purple flowers? Pea plants can have pink and purple flowers, so why are my pea plants all white flowered? Well, it has to do with their genetics. And hopefully in this video I can teach you a little bit about why these pea plants have white flowers. They actually come in handy when talking about genetics, so let's get right to it. Classical genetics really started with this gentleman here in the 1800s. His name was Gregor Mendel, and he was a monk. He was also a school teacher. It turns out he was also a gardener, and also he was somebody who was just curious about science. So he started experimenting with the plants in his garden. Most specifically, he started experimenting with the pea plants in his garden, as you can see here. They were easy to grow. He had some other things that really made them good experimental plants. So here's kind of a list of why he chose them. Number one, they were easy to grow, and he already knew how to grow them. So it's not like he had to figure out how to breed a new animal or a type of plant that he wasn't familiar with. The second thing is that pea plants produce large numbers of offspring, or plants in the next generation. So pea plants produce lots of pea pods, and inside those pea pods are numerous pea seeds. The pea seeds are what we eat, but if you let them dry out and then you plant them again and you let them germinate, you grow them in your garden a second time, you can get more pea plants. That's what gardening is all about. Turns out these pea plants produce hundreds or thousands of pea seeds, so he had lots of data to work with. It's not like his experiments were based on one or two pea plants. They were based on thousands of pea plants and a number of generations of pea plants, one after the other. The last thing, and perhaps the most important thing about the pea plants here in Mendel's experiments, were that the characteristics were easy to recognize. So some of the pea plants had white flowers, some had purple flowers, and he thought that this might be a genetic characteristic, the color of the flowers. Turns out he was right. The pea seeds and the pea pods actually have some genetic characteristics as well that he ended up experimenting with after some of his first experiments with the flowers. So here was his first experiment. He took a purple-flowered plant and he cross-pollinated it with a white-flowered plant. Those are like the parents of the experiment here. Those are the parents, the parental generation. And again, that cross in there means that he cross-pollinated them. These are not like animals that mate or anything like that. He had to do this manually. So he did that. He let the plants cross-pollinate. He let them produce seeds. He planted those seeds. He waited for those seeds to grow up into adult pea plants. And he evaluated what color flowers were produced from the seeds in the next generation. You can see here on the left-hand side this F1. This means F for filial. It means generation. So again, these four plants here represent the first generation of offspring or children, if you will. So he had lots and lots, hundreds potentially, of plants that were being grown, and he basically wanted to see how many of them were going to be purple and how many of them were going to be white. Turns out all of them, or 100% of them, were purple. So 100% of the F1 generation offspring were purple flowered. So pretend you're Gregor Mendel. You take a white flowered plant, a purple flowered plant, and you breed them, and in the next generation you get 100% purple plants. That seems kind of weird. For example, where did the white go? Well, to answer that question, Mendel had to do a second set of experiments. So here is Mendel's second experiment. Over on the left-hand side here, you can see his first experiment with the purple flower and the white flowered parent, and he ended up getting 100% purple flowered plants in that first generation. He then took two plants from that F1 generation, the all purple colored generation, and he cross-pollinated those. So these were actually sibling plants coming from the same parents. So he cross-pollinated those two purple flowered plants. He was expecting probably to get, again, 100% purple plants, because you breed a purple plant with a second purple plant. Well, why wouldn't you get more purple flowered offspring? So here was the results. So again, he grew up all the seeds, he counted a lot of them, he probably had hundreds or thousands of them to count. It turns out that when he counted them all, about 3/4 of them, or 75%, were purple flowered. And about 25%, or about 1 in every 4 plants, was white flowered. So by now, Mendel must have really been going crazy. He took two different color plants, and in their next generation after breeding them, got the same colored plant in all the offspring. Then he took two same colored plants, the two purple plants, and bred those together, and got offspring that were two different colors, purple and white. So he was trying to figure things out. Luckily, he was a really smart guy, and he started to put things together, and eventually came up with a system to describe what was going on. So to try to make sense of what he was seeing in his experiments, Mendel had to come up with some new vocabulary, and he came up with this term dominant trait, and it's simply a trait or characteristic that dominates over another one. And this is what he observed in his very first experiment, where he took the purple flowered plant and the white flowered plant, and he bred them, and 100% of the offspring ended up being purple. That's because the purple trait, or the trait for having purple flowers, is dominant over the trait for having white flowers. So despite the fact that there was a white-flowered parent, none of the offspring or F1 generation were white, because the purple was dominating over the white. Turns out there's actually a genetic reason for this in the DNA, but Mendel didn't know why this happened. He just knew that there was something called a dominant trait. Of course, if you're going to have a dominant trait, you have to have a name for the other trait, and he called that recessive. So he said that that is a trait that can be masked by the dominant trait, which is really the opposite of what a dominant trait is. So again, in the first set of experiments, the white was masked by the purple. Despite the fact that there was a purple-flowered parent, none of the offspring or F1 generation were white. They were all purple. So in this case, the white-flowered trait is the recessive trait. Okay, but wait. Even though we now know that Mendel came up with these two terms, dominant trait and recessive trait, we still haven't figured out why, in that F2 generation, all of a sudden the white-flowered plants sort of came back. In the first experiment, all the offspring were purple, even though the parent was white. But again, in the F2 generation, despite the fact that the two parents were purple, now all of a sudden there were white plants. Where did the white flower color come from? Well, that's sort of a topic for our next video, and in order to make this video not go on forever, we'll save that for that video tutorial. But let's summarize what we have learned in this video. Hopefully you learned that this guy named Gregor Mendel did some very important experiments with plants in his garden. He learned some very interesting things about the genetics of his pea plants, and to try to explain it all, he coined these two very important terms, dominant trait and recessive trait. Now, he learned some very important things about the genetics of his plants, but what he didn't realize was that the principles of genetics that he had discovered are really present in all organisms on Earth.